Hello everyone, RJM3 here. Welcome to Season 2 of What If, the alternate history series where I speculate what could have been if history had gone differently. After a long hiatus, I'm back and in my brand new gaming chair. This summer, I'm going to be bringing you all the freshest, high-quality alternate history content, starting right now.
China, one of the world's oldest civilizations, dating back thousands of years, going through many ups and downs along the way. But through all that time, China was always ruled by an absolute monarch, the emperor. Well, that was until 1911. After being subjected to numerous humiliating defeats at the hands of foreign powers during the Century of Humiliation, and massive corruption on the part of the ruling Qing dynasty, China broke out into revolution. The rebels, led by Sun Yat-sen, sought to overthrow the Qing and turn China into a modern, liberal republic that can stand up to foreign aggression. In 1912, that dream finally came true. China's last emperor was overthrown, and the Republic of China was founded. The republic then almost immediately collapsed, Sun Yat-sen died, and China fell into more than a decade of fighting between warlords. Two factions arose from the chaos of the warlord era, both claiming to be the legitimate continuation of Sun Yat-sen's original revolution. The Nationalists, otherwise known as the Kuomintang or the KMT, and the Communists, or the CPC. Though the two sides initially worked together to crush the remaining warlords, once the warlords were crushed, the Nationalists and Communists quickly turned on each other over ideology and vastly different visions for the future of China, and so the Chinese Civil War began. From 1927 to 1936, the two sides clashed and the Nationalists nearly snuffed out the Communists on a number of occasions. However, the infighting had to be put on hold, as China had to face a more external threat, the Empire of Japan. By 1936, the Japanese had already seized Manchuria and Inner Mongolia from China, and it became abundantly apparent that Japan was about to invade. The Nationalists were forced to join forces with the Communists in the Chinese United Front. In 1937, Japan formally declared war, and the Imperial Japanese Army invaded China, merrily committing many war crimes along the way. Over the course of the Second Sino-Japanese War, the Nationalists, under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek, would face the brunt of the Japanese onslaught and made quite a few tactical decisions against the Japanese that decreased their popularity. Meanwhile, the Communists, under the leadership of Mao Zedong, engaged the Japanese more sparingly and increased their popularity amongst the peasantry through their promises of land reform and getting rid of the landlords. When Japan was finally defeated by the Allied powers in 1945, the Chinese Civil War immediately started back up again, with the Communists in a much better position with some help from the Soviet Union. The Nationalists went on the offensive into Communist-held Manchuria and were once again about to destroy the CPC. However, in the dumbest and most short-sighted move in American history, U.S. President Harry S. Truman sent General George C. Marshall to China and had Chiang stop his attack on the Communists in order to try to negotiate a peace between the two sides and form a unity government in the Marshall Mission. Truman's well-meaning but completely idiotic plan went about as well as you'd expect. Not only did this fail to bring peace, but it distracted the Nationalists long enough for the Communists to resupply, rally all their supporters, and go on the offensive, driving the Nationalists off the Chinese mainland and flee to the island of Taiwan, where the Republic of China remains to this day. On October 1st, 1945, Mao declared the establishment of the People's Republic of China. Mao would rule China for the next 3 decades with his own special brand of communism, Maoism. Mao would implement many policies which would fundamentally reshape China, such as the Cultural Revolution, which was meant to indoctrinate the masses and purge any capitalist or traditional elements from Chinese culture. A more notable project by Mao was the Great Leap Forward, which was meant to transform China from an agrarian economy to a truly industrialized communist society. The Great Leap Forward proceeded to result in the deaths of 15 to 55 million people by starvation, because as it turns out, collectivization, and communism as a whole, doesn't actually work. Who would have thought? After the death of Mao in 1976 and the apparent failure of the Maoist system, China, under the de facto leadership of Deng Xiaoping, reformed to combine socialist ideology with free enterprise, or socialism with Chinese characteristics, with China becoming communist in name only. Now in the present day, China's government is a totalitarian, bitter, and hateful entity. morally indistinguishable from Nazi Germany, seeking revenge on the West for the century of humiliation through world domination. Whether it be through stamping out Hong Kong's democracy and autonomy, hostile expansion into the South China Sea, using its massive influence over the world economy to control and censor people and organizations in other countries, coercing third world nations through the Belt and Road Initiative, or committing genocide against the Uyghur people in the Xinjiang province.
But what if the world never had to deal with this threat? What if the People's Republic of China never existed? What if the Nationalists won the Chinese Civil War?
So there are a few things we can change in order for the Nationalists to win the Civil War. First off, we need to improve their performance in World War II. For example, in 1937, the Nationalists could inflict even heavier losses on the Japanese at the Battle of Shanghai than in our timeline. Because of that, Chiang could decide not to abandon Nanking within days and resist the Japanese for at least a month, and even manage to evacuate most of the civilian population from the city, preventing much of the Nanking Massacre. Also, in 1938, we can have Chiang decide not to cause the Yellow River flood to try to stop the Japanese from taking Wuhan, preventing the deaths of 400 to 900,000 Chinese civilians and a massive PR disaster for the Kuomintang, though this may result in Japan capturing Wuhan much sooner. When the war finally ends in 1945, the Nationalists are much more popular with the public than in our timeline, but the Communists still remain a threat. Our final and most important point of divergence is that the Marshall Mission never happens. Either President Truman simply never comes up with the idea, or perhaps Chiang outright rejects Truman's call for an armistice. With much greater support from the Chinese people, the Nationalists' offensive into communist-controlled Manchuria is unhindered and unrelenting. 1946. The Communists are defeated, Mao is captured, and the Chinese Civil War is over. The Nationalists have won, restoring the Republic of China with its capital in Nanking. So now what? After the end of the Civil War, the Nationalists would have to govern over a China still plagued by economic problems such as hyperinflation, heavy taxes, and devastated infrastructure thanks to the Japanese invasion. China's economy at that point in time was basically non-existent. So how does Chiang Kai-shek and the Nationalist Party tackle this problem? Well, in our timeline, the Nationalists had actually implemented their own land reform in Taiwan, getting rid of the landlord class just like the Communists on the mainland.
You know, minus the part where they brutally murdered all the landlords.
It's also important to mention that, unlike on the mainland, after the land was taken from the landlord class and given to the peasants, the state did not proceed to seize the land for itself and collectivize it. Instead, the land stayed in control of individual farmers, allowing the economy to grow and develop naturally. This, among other economic developments later on, led Taiwan to become one of the most successful and economically prosperous countries in East Asia. If the same reforms are implemented on the mainland, however, not only would any remaining sympathy for the communists among the peasant class dissipate, but millions of deaths caused by the Great Leap Forward would be avoided, and China would be on the road to economic recovery from World War II much sooner than in our timeline. But we'll get back to that later. There are two other issues we need to discuss: East Turkestan and Tibet. Now, if there's one thing the Nationalists and the Communists agreed on, it was that East Turkestan, Tibet, and even Mongolia were all part of China. Back in 1944, the native Uyghurs in the northern part of the Xinjiang province rebelled against the Kuomintang with the help of the Soviet Union in the Ili Rebellion, establishing the Second East Turkestan Republic. But once the Communists had won the Civil War in our timeline, the Soviets were more than happy to throw the Uyghurs under the bus and allow China to keep all of East Turkestan, relabel it as Xinjiang, and eventually commit genocide on the Uyghur people decades later. But in the wake of a nationalist victory, however, the Soviet Union would not be as willing to give up their sphere of influence in the region and would continue to support the Uyghurs. The likely end result of this is that the conflict would end in a stalemate, with the nationalists holding on to most of East Turkestan, while the Uyghur rebels get to keep their own separate state in the north, likely becoming a Soviet puppet state just like Mongolia. Though Tibet would be annexed by China a few years later without much issue, control over East Turkestan and Mongolia would likely become a point of contention between China and the USSR, generating a greater number of border conflicts than in our timeline for the duration of this alternate Cold War. June 25th, 1950. The Korean War still breaks out with the communist North Koreans invading the anti-communist South Korea. The United Nations meet to condemn the invasion and votes on a resolution to intervene in the conflict to aid South Korea. However, in this timeline, the resolution is vetoed by the Soviet Union. In our timeline, the Soviet Union had been boycotting the UN at the time to protest Taiwan being on the UN Security Council and not the PRC. But if Communist China no longer exists, the USSR never boycotts the UN and uses its veto power to veto the resolution, preventing a US-led coalition from intervening in the Korean War. With the veto, the North Koreans foresee victory on the horizon as they no longer have reason to worry about American intervention. But as it turns out, they'll instead have to worry about a different problem: Chinese intervention. Chiang Kai-shek would not have tolerated total communist control of the Korean peninsula and would have seen the war as the communists trying to surround China. Chiang, being the radical anti-communist he was, would preemptively invade North Korea with or without the UN's approval. The UN would definitely object to Chinese intervention, but it's the UN, so it's not like they'd actually do anything to stop them. The Chinese crossed the Yalu River into the Korean peninsula. North Korea would have to move a huge part of their army to stop the Chinese, giving South Korea time to regroup and resupply with help from the US. The Soviet Union considers retaliation, but considering how such an action may incur counter-retaliation from NATO, thus putting the USSR in a two-front war, the Soviets would back down and leave North Korea to its fate. North Korea is vanquished and the peninsula is united under the Republic of Korea. In the aftermath of the conflict, the Cold War heads in a somewhat different direction. Without a communist China and with an anti-communist victory in Korea, the domino theory as we know it would never exist. And without the domino theory, the United States would never get directly involved in the Vietnam War. As a result, North Vietnam may have won the war earlier, but it's also possible that without the threat of retaliation by a communist China and weaker support from the Soviet Union, that South Vietnam may win the conflict through military advisors and supplies from the US and conquer North Vietnam, or at least secure their own independence from the North, keeping Vietnam divided into two. But regardless of which possibility you choose to believe in, what is certain is that a large amount of pressure of the Cold War is taken off Asia. Instead, more focus from the US and USSR would turn towards Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East. In Vietnam's place, American troops may instead be sent to Nicaragua, Angola, Rhodesia, or Iran, just to name a few possibilities. Returning our focus to China, going into the 1960s, the country would be entering an era of prosperity, thanks to aforementioned land reforms by the KMT, increased liberalization of the market, and opening up China to the outside world decades sooner than in our timeline. But an anti-communist and free market capitalist China is not necessarily a pro-NATO China. Remember, one of the main goals of the 1911 revolution was to make a strong China that would not be subjected to the whim of foreigners. If anything, China would likely join the non-alignment movement. Chiang Kai-shek really wanted to undo the unfair concessions to the Western powers, and in the aftermath of World War II, only two concessions remained: British Hong Kong and Portuguese Macau. In our timeline, China didn't get back Hong Kong and Macau until the late 90s, but in this alternate timeline, China might be able to retake those cities sooner. Since America took a hard stance against colonialism after World War II, and because China isn't a communist power, the United States might actually push Britain and Portugal to forfeit Hong Kong and Macau to the Republic of China to improve Western relations with the Chinese in the late 60s or the early 70s. America going against its European allies to get them to give up their colonial claims is not really that absurd. After all, that's exactly what happened during the Suez Crisis with Egypt, so why not China? 1975. Chiang Kai-shek dies and is succeeded by Yen Chiakan as president. After decades of one-party rule under the Kuomintang, China would finally begin to liberalize. The goal of the Nationalists was always to have a democratic China, they just wanted to wait for China's situation to stabilize before they did so. China would likely complete its transition to democracy sometime in the 1980s. This is in sharp contrast to China in our timeline, where in 1989, student protesters came together in Tiananmen Square to protest the Chinese Communist Party and to call for democracy. But unfortunately for those student protesters, the CCP, knowing that a liberated and free-thinking population would only get in the way of their plans for world domination, had them all massacred. Anyway, back in the alternate timeline, with the Republic of China finally becoming a republic, not only would the Chinese people enjoy a great amount of autonomy in their own personal lives, but so would all the other ethnicities within China's borders. The Uyghurs living inside of China would never be persecuted for their race or religion, and for the most part are allowed to live in peace, just like the Scottish in the United Kingdom or the Catalonians in Spain. The Uyghurs living outside of China would be able to govern themselves in their own sovereign state once the Soviet Union collapses. Even if the 1959 Tibet uprising still took place, the Dalai Lama was exiled, and Tibetan culture suppressed, following democratization, the government would go easier on the Tibetans. But it's highly unlikely the Chinese government would just allow Tibet to secede and become an independent nation. Any attempt to leave China, such as a referendum, would be met with failure, as is the case for most independence movements in the modern era. At the turn of the 21st century, China is a robust and prosperous first-world democracy that enjoys cordial relations with the outside world. Mostly. However, while this version of China is not a totalitarian state capitalist regime, they would still be a serious competitor against Western countries in the world economy. China, having the world's largest population, also has the world's largest workforce, which would be even larger without the Great Leap Forward or the one-child policy. So China becoming a serious competitor for the West was pretty much an inevitability, though in this alternate timeline, the methods by which China would use to get ahead of the West would be far less vicious and instead be of a more friendly nature, similar to the relationship between the US and the EU.
Now before we end this video, there's one more thing I'd like to talk about in relation to how it would be affected by a nationalist victory in the Civil War. And I really do think it would be a disservice to not talk about it in a post-2020 world. The coronavirus pandemic.
Despite it having been a full year and a half since the first cases of COVID-19 were reported in Wuhan, we still don't have a consensus on where exactly the virus came from. The most commonly accepted theory is that the virus naturally evolved to infect humans and that it came from bats being sold in the Wuhan wet market. Another theory suggests that the coronavirus is not natural and was instead grown inside a lab in the Wuhan Institute of Virology, where it accidentally escaped. Some are even going as far as to suggest the Chinese government deliberately unleashed the virus to weaken and destabilize the rest of the world for their own gain. Now that last theory sounds a bit extreme, but given all the horrific things the CCP have been willing to do in the past and the present, is it really that far-fetched? Regardless of which theory you believe, if the Nationalists won the Chinese Civil War, the coronavirus pandemic would not have happened. If the virus was naturally occurring, the Republic of China, acting like any rational, sane country, immediately warns the public and the international community of the Wuhan outbreak. Social distancing measures are put in place early on, and the city is immediately quarantined. Some people still die, but only in Wuhan. After a few months of lockdown, the virus is unable to infect enough hosts and eventually dies out. If the virus was created in a lab in our timeline, then the coronavirus wouldn't exist at all in the alternate timeline. March 2020 comes and goes. There is no global lockdown. Businesses aren't forced to close, children aren't forced out of school, and there is no shortage of toilet paper. Instead, 2020 becomes a much better and more hopeful year for a new decade. But of course, we couldn't have that now, could we? The CCP just had to screw it all up. And to add insult to injury, after all this, China is stronger than it ever has been before, and the United States has become far weaker, especially in terms of leadership. However, I suppose there's still hope that China will be stopped. Thanks to the One China policy, China's population could implode in a few decades, but we'll just have to wait and see.
Well guys, I hope you enjoyed the Season 2 premiere, because there are going to be more videos on the way all summer long. Remember to like, share, subscribe, and follow me on Instagram. This has been RJM3, Alternate Historian. Have a nice day.